Racist woman tore the uniform thinking she was just a black waitress. Her millionaire husband saw everything. In the heart of New York City, where ambition never sleeps and skyscrapers mirror the stars, a young woman named Amara Johnson quietly carried the weight of her dreams. At 26, she was a Columbia University MBA student, sharp, disciplined, and relentlessly focused. Her days began before sunrise, with the hum of the subway, the faint taste of cheap coffee, and the heavy pages of economic theory. And when most of her classmates returned to their expensive apartments at night, Amara changed into her catering uniform and clocked in at the Langston Grand Hotel, serving the same people who built the systems she studied. Every night, she crossed the marble lobby with her chin slightly raised, not in pride but in resilience. She wasn't embarrassed by the uniform. It was her armor, her tuition, her rent, her younger brother Malik's education. All depended on those long shifts and aching feet. Malik was still in high school, a quiet genius with a love for computers. Their parents had passed away when Amara was barely out of college, and since then, she'd promised herself that he would never have to face the kind of struggle she did. Her life was a careful balance between intellect and exhaustion. Mornings were for lectures and research. Nights were for endless trays and forced smiles. But beneath that calm exterior, she was building something powerful. A thesis that explored racial discrimination in corporate and social hierarchies. It wasn't just an academic pursuit. It was personal. Her years in service jobs had taught her what textbooks couldn't. The small gestures, the dismissive glances, the invisible walls that divided people long before words were spoken. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. That Saturday night, the Langston Grand shimmered like a palace. The annual Langston Charity Gala was the event of the season, drawing the city's wealthiest and most photographed guests. The ballroom glowed with soft light, the chandeliers reflected in endless rows of crystal glasses, and a string quartet filled the air with polished elegance. It was a night of excess disguised as generosity, where people congratulated themselves for caring, just before turning their backs on those they claimed to help. For Amara, it was another shift. Another night to endure before dawn returned her to her real world of ideas and goals. She adjusted her apron, tied her hair neatly, and tucked a small voice recorder into the pocket of her uniform. It wasn't for gossip or secrets. It was research. For months, she'd been documenting moments of subtle bias at elite gatherings. The tone of voice used with servers, the careless assumptions, the way smiles faded when someone who looked like her entered the frame. She never expected the night to give her more material than she could handle. The guest list buzzed through the staff corridors. Claudia Whitmore, heiress-turned-socialite, would be arriving with her husband, Gregory Whitmore, a millionaire investment banker and philanthropist. The Whitmores were the kind of couple that magazines adored. Gregory had built a reputation for his charitable work and calm intelligence. Claudia, however, was known for something else entirely. Her extravagant style, her sharp tongue, and her obsession with social dominance. Her life was a gallery of curated perfection. Private jets, designer gowns, and charity appearances that doubled as photo opportunities. When Claudia entered the ballroom that night, conversation paused. Her silver gown sparkled under the chandeliers, the diamonds around her neck catching every flash of the camera. She smiled at photographers, waved at admirers, and glided through the crowd like she owned the air itself. Gregory followed, his expression polite but distant, as if he had long learned to live in the shadow of her theatrics. Amara noticed her only in passing. She was focused on her work, weaving through tables with practiced precision. Years of catering had trained her to read a room without looking directly at it, to sense when a glass needed refilling, when a guest wanted to be invisible, and when someone wanted to be seen. That night, she saw many of them, the polished men boasting about donations that came from underpaid workers, the women whose compliments dripped with quiet cruelty. It was all part of the performance. But Amara wasn't there to judge. She was there to survive, to observe, to finish her shift, and make it home in time to call Malik. She smiled faintly at the thought of him, probably asleep over his coding homework, unaware of how hard his sister worked to keep their world intact. Hours passed. The speeches began. Waiters moved like a well-rehearsed ballet, serving courses with grace. Amara's hands ached, her back protested, but she didn't show it. Then, as she passed between two crowded tables, she felt a sudden tug of air, the soft brush of her tray against the edge of a silver gown. It was nothing, barely a movement, but in that world, nothing could become everything if the wrong eyes noticed. Claudia Whitmore turned sharply. Her gaze locked on Amara, her lips parting in theatrical disbelief. Around her, conversations faltered. The hum of the room softened, the kind of silence that anticipates something unpleasant. Amara froze for half a heartbeat, then stepped back, instinctively whispering an apology under her breath. But Claudia didn't hear apologies. She heard offense. An offense to her was an invitation to perform. No one could have predicted how far she'd go. Not the guests who averted their eyes. Not Gregory, who would soon wish he'd spoken sooner. And certainly not Amara, who had no idea that her recorder, tucked quietly against her apron, was about to capture the moment that would change all of their lives forever. That night, the story wasn't about champagne or charity. It was about what happens when arrogance meets dignity, and the world finally starts paying attention. The air in the ballroom grew heavy the instant Claudia Whitmore turned. Her expression, a perfect mask of indignation, was enough to silence an entire orchestra. A few guests noticed, others pretended not to, but everyone felt the shift. Amara stood frozen, still clutching her tray. A single droplet of red wine trembled on the rim of Claudia's glass, then fell, staining the edge of her silver gown. That was all the excuse she needed. Claudia's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening as she looked Amara up and down like she was inspecting something beneath her. The humiliation began not with shouting, but with tone. Sharp, precise, dripping with condescension. The kind that cuts deeper than anger ever could. She accused Amara of being careless, untrained, and unfit for events of this caliber. The surrounding tables shifted uncomfortably. Some guests glanced away. Others raised their glasses higher, pretending not to hear. Amara's throat tightened, but she held her composure. Years of working in places like this had taught her one survival skill: silence. A quiet apology escaped her lips, but Claudia wasn't finished. She leaned forward, eyes glittering with a cruel sort of satisfaction, and said something about people like you and learning your place. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed the words, leaving behind an echo that refused to die. Amara felt her chest tighten. Her instinct screamed to leave, to walk away, to keep her dignity intact. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not while the room watched her like a spectacle. Then came the sound, the faint rip of fabric. Claudia's perfectly manicured hands gripped Amara's apron and tore it at the shoulder, the motion so sudden that gasps erupted around the room. The tray clattered to the floor, glasses shattering like punctuation to the horror unfolding. Red wine splashed across the marble, across Amara's white uniform, and across her quiet restraint. The humiliation burned. The sting wasn't just from the torn fabric, but from the laughter that followed, nervous, unsure, yet complicit. No one stopped her. Not the managers. Not the guests. The same people who moments earlier had toasted equality and humanity now hid behind champagne flutes, avoiding the scene as though silence made them innocent. Claudia smirked, satisfied, and turned away as if the moment hadn't mattered. To her, it was a minor display of dominance, a fleeting assertion of control. But to Amara, it was something far deeper. It was the moment her quiet dignity was tested in full view of the powerful. Her hands trembled as she gathered the fallen pieces of glass. Her breathing steadied only when she remembered the recorder. The small device tucked beneath her apron had captured every word, every insult, every ounce of venom. She didn't know why she thought of it then, but a single thought cut through the fog of shame. This can't be buried. She excused herself quietly and walked toward the restroom, each step heavy but deliberate. The chatter of the gala resumed behind her, forced and uneasy. Inside the restroom, the noise faded, replaced by the faint hum of fluorescent light. She stared at her reflection. The tear in her uniform, the red stains, the glisten of unshed tears. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the recorder, and pressed play. Claudia's voice filled the small space. Cold, sharp, unapologetic. Each word was proof. It wasn't just an insult anymore. It was evidence of the rot that hid beneath polished manners and million-dollar smiles. Outside, Gregory Whitmore had noticed something was wrong. He'd caught a glimpse of his wife's smirk, the torn fabric, the shocked faces. When Amara returned, composed but pale, he intercepted her near the hallway. He apologized softly, sincerely, and asked what had happened. For the first time, Amara spoke more than a few words. She told him who she was, what she studied, and why she was there. Gregory listened in silence. He had built his fortune in boardrooms where discrimination wore suits instead of slurs, and he knew exactly what he'd just witnessed. The weight of shame settled on his face. He offered to make things right, but Amara didn't ask for pity. She simply nodded and left, her silence speaking more than outrage ever could. That night, she rode the bus home with her uniform still stained and her mind racing. Malik was asleep when she arrived, and she didn't wake him. She sat by the window, replaying the audio again and again. Each time, it hurt less and fueled her more. She had spent years studying systemic bias, writing about how prejudice hides in plain sight. Now she had something undeniable, a real, raw moment that showed the world what those theories looked like when they cut flesh and pride. The next morning, headlines buzzed about the success of the gala. Photos of Claudia smiling beside politicians and philanthropists filled social media feeds. No one mentioned the waitress. Not yet. But Amara knew this wasn't over. 2 days later, she received a call from an unknown number. Gregory Whitmore's voice came through, calm but deliberate. He invited her to meet at his office. Not to apologize again, but to talk about a project, a diversity and inclusion initiative that he wanted her to lead. It would give her authority to review company culture, pay equity, and internal bias. She hesitated at first, unsure if it was genuine or guilt-driven. But something in his tone told her this was more than a gesture. It was a step. When the news reached Claudia, her composure cracked. Rage replaced her practiced grace. She stormed into her husband's office, demanding that he retract the offer. He refused. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't defend her. "She has more class in her silence," he told her, "than you've shown in your entire life." The argument became the talk of the staff, the scandal that no one dared to mention publicly. But behind the Whitmores' closed doors, a storm was brewing. Claudia's pride couldn't tolerate being undermined, not by her husband, and certainly not by the woman she'd humiliated. Days passed, but the unease didn't fade, because somewhere in the background, something far more explosive was coming. The recording, the one Amara had kept carefully hidden, was no longer just a private memory. Someone, somehow, would soon make sure the world heard every single word. And when it did, no amount of wealth or charm would be enough to silence the truth. The first cracks in Claudia Whitmore's perfect life didn't appear with headlines. They began with whispers. Quiet at first, like background noise in the circles she ruled. At an art exhibition, someone avoided her greeting. At brunch, an old friend abruptly canceled. Her name, once associated with style and influence, began carrying a new undertone. People didn't say it aloud yet, but the story was spreading. Something had happened at the gala, something ugly. 3 weeks after that night, the truth broke wide open. A 3-minute audio clip appeared online, posted anonymously under the title, What really happened at the Langston Charity Gala? Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The voice was unmistakable, Claudia's. The laughter, the mockery, the rip of fabric. The internet didn't need context. It didn't need to see the video. The sound alone was enough to set it ablaze. Comment sections are filled with outrage. News anchors replayed the recording on national television. Millionaire's wife humiliates black waitress. Caught on tape. The headlines read, "The world that once adored Claudia suddenly turned on her." Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Brands issued public statements cutting ties. Clubs revoked memberships. Charities she supported deleted her name from their websites. Her PR team resigned by noon. By evening, protesters were already standing outside her mansion gates holding signs that read, "Accountability has no dress code." Inside the mansion, Claudia sat motionless in her robe, the screen of her phone glowing faintly against the dark. She'd watched the recording a dozen times, each word stabbing deeper. The laughter she once thought harmless now sounded cruel, monstrous even. She tried to call Gregory, but he didn't answer. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked like her. A face stripped of power, framed by regret she didn't know how to carry. Across the city, Amara sat in her small apartment, the same audio playing softly from her laptop. But unlike the rest of the world, she wasn't celebrating. She hadn't posted it. She didn't even know who did. The attention, the noise, the chaos. It all felt overwhelming. Her inbox overflowed with messages. Reporters, activists, strangers thanking her for her bravery. But bravery wasn't what she felt. She felt exposed, raw, and strangely heavy. That night, she took the long walk to campus. The streets were quiet, the chill biting at her skin. The city's hum distant but constant. She stood beneath Columbia's old stone archway and closed her eyes. The same people who once ignored her now wanted to make her a symbol. But she didn't want to be a headline. She wanted to be a lesson. The following morning, Gregory called. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the exhaustion. He told her the board at Whitmore Capital had approved the diversity initiative, and they wanted her to lead it. Not as a token gesture, but as an executive position with full authority to audit the company's culture and practices. "It's time someone honest leads this conversation," he said quietly. Amara hesitated. The world was spinning around her story, turning it into content, hashtags, and debates. But beneath it all, something real was beginning. A chance to turn humiliation into reform. She accepted. The news broke that afternoon, and it sent shockwaves through the city. Whitmore Capital appoints black student humiliated at gala as director of cultural reform. The same networks that had once replayed her pain now broadcast her strength. But not everyone saw it that way. Claudia's fury boiled into desperation. She showed up at the firm's glass tower 2 days later, dressed impeccably but shaking with rage. The security guard at the entrance refused to let her in until Gregory came down. When he did, his face said everything. There was no warmth left, only finality. "You made me a joke," she hissed, her voice low enough to keep cameras from catching it. Gregory's response was quiet, measured. "No, Claudia," he said. "You made yourself one." Then he walked away. Divorce papers followed within a week. The media called it poetic justice. Her friends called it inevitable. But to Claudia, it felt like the world she'd built had collapsed overnight. Her apology video, shot in her living room with tearful eyes and trembling hands, did little to help. Viewers called it rehearsed, insincere, another performance. The comments below were merciless. "Too late. She's sorry she got caught. Not for what she did." Meanwhile, Amara stepped into her new role at Whitmore Capital. The first few weeks were difficult. Rooms filled with executives twice her age, all skeptical of the young woman hired in the wake of scandal. But she didn't waver. She led with quiet confidence, using data, stories, and logic to build bridges instead of walls. Slowly, resistance turned into respect. Her reforms began showing results: new hiring practices, fairer pay evaluations, and leadership accountability. Other corporations began taking notice. The woman once dismissed as just a waitress was now shaping policies that would outlast the scandal itself. But the moment that defined the climax came months later, when Amara stood on stage at a national ethics conference, delivering a talk titled "The Price of Silence." In the audience sat professors, CEOs, journalists, and activists. She didn't mention Claudia by name, but everyone knew. Her voice was steady, but her words carried weight. Every act of humiliation, every moment of injustice, is not just about the person who endures it. It's about everyone who stays silent. Because silence, she said, pausing as the hall grew still, is the luxury of those untouched by pain. As applause filled the room, cameras captured her standing tall, no longer a victim of someone's cruelty, but a voice that had transformed it into change. Outside, on the streets where protesters had once shouted for justice, Claudia's name still lingered on posters fading under the rain. Her mansion was quiet. Her calls went unanswered. The world had moved on without her. And somewhere in a Columbia classroom, a professor used the audio from that night as a case study in ethics, how one act of arrogance exposed an entire system of denial. The sound of that tear, that moment of humiliation, had become something far more powerful. Proof that dignity, once tested, can rebuild empires of truth. The story wasn't just about what Claudia did. It was about what Amara became because of it. And in that transformation, a question remained. One that echoed long after the applause ended. How many more injustices are we still pretending not to see? The weeks after the conference felt strangely quiet for Amara. The noise that once filled her life, the viral interviews, the messages, the endless notifications, had finally faded. She could walk through the city again without cameras waiting for her outside her apartment. But the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, earned. Her days were full now, but in a different way. Meetings turned into mentorship sessions. She spent her evenings visiting schools, talking to young women who reminded her of herself a few years ago. Hopeful, uncertain, still learning to believe they belonged in rooms that weren't built for them. She wasn't lecturing. She was sharing. And that made all the difference. Whitmore Capital, once a symbol of old money and exclusivity, looked different, too. The changes she'd helped put in motion didn't erase the past, but they reshaped the company's future. Interns of color filled the hallways. Diversity reports weren't hidden behind PR statements anymore. They were discussed openly with accountability. The walls that once seemed untouchable were beginning to breathe. Gregory kept his word. He stood by every reform, every uncomfortable conversation. The press called it the Whitmore redemption arc. But for him, it wasn't about redemption. It was about reflection. He had watched the woman he loved destroy someone's dignity and, in doing so, expose his own blind spots. Supporting Amara's vision wasn't charity. It was responsibility. As for Claudia, her story took a quieter path. After the divorce, she disappeared from public life. The mansion was sold, the accounts divided. She moved to a small town along the coast, away from the headlines, away from the noise. Some said she joined a community center as a volunteer. Others said she spent her days writing letters to people she'd wronged. No one really knew, but one story surfaced a year later. A photo, blurry and half-shadowed, showed Claudia standing outside a small shelter for young mothers. No makeup, no designer clothes, just her. The caption read, "Sometimes the lesson costs everything." Whether it was redemption or guilt, no one could say. But it reminded people that even those who fall the hardest can still choose how they rise. For Amara, the journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something much deeper: her voice, her worth, her peace. She learned that power isn't in how loud the world listens to you. It's in the strength to keep speaking when it doesn't. Months later, she returned to the same hotel where everything had begun, the Langston Gala Hall. This time, she wasn't serving guests. She was being honored. The city's Cultural Equity Committee presented her with an award for advocacy in workplace reform. As she stood under the same chandelier that once glimmered over her humiliation, she smiled. It wasn't triumph, it was closure. Her speech that night was simple, but unforgettable. "I used to think injustice was loud," she said, "that it was easy to recognize. But the truth is, it's quiet. It hides in small moments. A look, a tone, a word that cuts deeper than it should. It survives because people pretend it's not there. The real fight isn't against hatred. It's against denial." The room went still. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some ashamed, some inspired, some deeply moved. "We can't fix the world in one night," she continued softly, "but we can choose not to be the reason someone else loses faith in it." Applause followed. Not the kind that erupts instantly, but the kind that builds real, honest, from the gut. Afterward, an older woman approached her quietly, tears in her eyes. "My daughter went through something like you did," she said. "She gave up. I wish she could hear you now." Amara smiled gently, touched her hand, and said, "Then tell her she still can." Outside, as she stepped into the cool night air, Amara looked up at the city skyline. It shimmered, cold and beautiful like it always had, but it felt different now. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was the weight she'd finally set down. Her story wasn't about race alone. It was about power, dignity, and the courage to stand tall when the world wants you to stay small. It was about how one moment of cruelty exposed an entire culture of silence, and how one woman refused to let that be the end of her story. Because racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through everyday choices, through who we hire, who we listen to, and who we believe. And changing that isn't the work of a moment. It's the work of a lifetime. So before you scroll past another story, before you shrug and say, "That's just the way things are," ask yourself, if silence built this system, what would happen if we all finally spoke? The screen fades to black. The soft hum of city noise lingers for a few seconds longer, followed by the final words on screen. Every story of injustice deserves an ending written in truth. Then, a quiet voiceover. If the story moved you, share it. Not for views, for awareness. Because silence helps no one, but your voice might. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were in Amara's place? Do you think Claudia deserved a second chance? Or was justice already served? Your voice matters more than you think. Stories like this remind us how small actions can create real change. If you want to hear more powerful stories that expose truth, inspire courage, and challenge injustice, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss one.